In the vast Pacific, Japan's empire once ruled unchallenged, its warships cutting across the ocean like steel dragons, its flag stretching from China to the Philippines. But then, the sea went silent. No explosions. No grand battles. Just ships, vanishing. Tankers that once carried vital oil to Japan never returned. Merchant convoys disappeared without a trace. At first, Tokyo thought it was fate. Then they realized, it was the Americans. From the dark depths of the ocean came an enemy no radar could find, no aircraft could bomb, and no admiral could predict. Silent hunters, armed with torpedoes and patience, waged a war Japan could neither see nor stop. And as the months passed, the empire that roared with pride began to whisper in fear. Because sometimes, the loudest victories are won in absolute silence. At the start of World War II, Japan's empire stood as an unstoppable force. Its navy ruled the Pacific, its armies swept across Asia, and its commanders believed no power could challenge their might. The rising sun burned bright, confident, proud, and utterly certain of victory. But beneath the waves, another kind of war was waiting, a war fought not with massive fleets or thunderous guns, but with shadows, whispers, and silence. The U.S. submarine fleet was small, untested, and often underestimated. In the early days, their torpedoes failed, their crews struggled, and many missions ended in frustration. Yet from those failures emerged a new breed of warrior, men who learned to fight unseen, to strike without warning, and to disappear into the depths before the enemy could react. As Japan expanded its empire, it unknowingly built its own trap. Every island, every ship, every supply line depended on the sea. And soon, those very waters would turn against them. This is the story of how America's silent service, the submariners of World War II, choked an empire from beneath the surface, and left Japan's proud commanders stunned by the quietest defeat in history. In the dark months following Pearl Harbor, America's pride had been wounded, its fleet scattered, and its confidence shaken. The Japanese Navy seemed untouchable. From the Philippines to the South Pacific, their flag ruled the waves. But deep beneath those same waves, a new kind of warrior was preparing for vengeance. They were few in number, outgunned, and underestimated, yet they held one advantage the enemy could never match: the ocean's silence. The men of the U.S. Navy's silent service knew their mission would not bring glory or fame. Submariners operated in isolation, with no headlines or cheering crowds, only darkness, pressure, and fear. Inside those steel tubes, life was measured in heartbeats and depth charges. The ocean above was both shield and prison. One mistake could mean eternal rest at the bottom of the Pacific. But they accepted it, because revenge demanded patience. In the early days, it didn't go well. The Mark 14 torpedoes, America's primary weapon, were defective. They ran too deep, failed to explode, or detonated prematurely. Many commanders watched in horror as their perfect shots bounced off enemy hulls. Washington refused to believe their complaints, blaming crews for poor marksmanship. For the men risking everything underwater, it was infuriating. Yet even through failure, they adapted. Commanders like Charles Lockwood, Mush Morton, and Eugene Fluckey refused to quit. They learned to think like predators, not soldiers. They tested new depths, refined attack patterns, and studied enemy routes like hunters studying their prey. Sink 'em all became their battle cry, not born from arrogance, but from desperation. The Japanese, confident in their surface fleet's supremacy, never imagined submarines could threaten their empire. Their anti-submarine warfare was primitive: few sonar-equipped ships, almost no escort tactics, and a belief that honor existed only in visible battle. To them, fighting from the shadows was beneath the samurai spirit. But that arrogance would cost them dearly. By mid-1943, the silent service was no longer learning, it was dominating. American subs prowled the shipping lanes like wolves, waiting for convoys that never realized they were being stalked. A single torpedo hit could send thousands of tons of supplies, oil, ammunition, food, to the ocean floor. And each loss was a wound Japan couldn't see, but couldn't survive without. In one haunting report, Japanese commanders noted mysterious disappearances of merchant ships in the South China Sea. Convoys sent to reinforce garrisons in the Pacific never arrived. Tankers filled with oil from the Dutch East Indies vanished somewhere between Borneo and Formosa. The Imperial Navy began to suspect sabotage, but the truth was far deadlier. Every attack began the same way: silence. The ocean calm. Then a sudden echo, the metallic hiss of a torpedo leaving its tube. Moments later, a thunderous explosion shattered the sea. Flames burst to the surface, men screamed, and then, silence again. The submarine had already vanished into the deep, leaving nothing but burning oil and twisted steel behind. To the Japanese, it seemed like the sea itself had turned traitor. To the Americans, it was justice delivered by ghosts. The war in the Pacific was vast and brutal, but the U.S. submariners were writing a secret chapter, one that would never be told in real time, one that would remain hidden until long after victory. They weren't fighting for headlines or medals. They were fighting to starve an empire, one torpedo at a time. And soon, their silent war would begin to strangle Japan's heartbeat. By 1944, the tide of war was turning, not with massive fleets or sweeping battles, but with something Japan could barely comprehend: disappearance. Every day, another Japanese ship failed to reach port. Tankers loaded with oil from the Dutch East Indies vanished without trace. Cargo ships bringing rice, rubber, and steel were found drifting, split in two, black smoke rising where men once stood. Japan's empire, stretched across thousands of miles, was beginning to choke, and no one could see the hands around its throat. The U.S. submarine fleet had perfected the art of invisible warfare. They no longer attacked blindly, they stalked, they calculated, they waited. Submarines like the USS Tang, USS Barb, and USS Wahoo became legends whispered across the Pacific. Commanders studied enemy shipping routes, ambush zones, and tides. They knew exactly when and where to strike, and when they did, it was devastating. A convoy might set out from Singapore carrying vital fuel for the Imperial Navy. Hours later, sonar operators aboard an American sub would pick up faint propeller sounds. Slowly, carefully, the submarine would dive, glide into position, and fire. 1, 2, sometimes 6 torpedoes, streaking silently through the black. Moments later, chaos. A flash of light. A sound like the world tearing apart. Ships rolled, men screamed, and in seconds, the ocean swallowed them whole. These weren't just isolated attacks, they were surgical strikes on Japan's arteries. Every torpedo that found its mark didn't just sink a ship, it erased thousands of tons of supplies Japan desperately needed. By mid-1944, American submarines had destroyed nearly 2/3 of Japan's merchant fleet. Without fuel, planes couldn't fly. Without food, soldiers starved. Without steel, factories went silent. The empire that once marched with thunder now limped in hunger and fear. In Tokyo, panic began to spread among naval staff. Admiral Manichi Koga, who succeeded Yamamoto, received endless reports of unexplained shipping losses. Japan's military leaders demanded answers, but their options were limited. They had too few escort ships, no radar network, and no organized anti-submarine force. The Imperial Navy had been built for glory, for surface combat and grand victories, not for this unseen, unending slaughter. The Japanese tried everything. They rerouted convoys, sent them through new channels, and armed merchant ships with deck guns. None of it mattered. The Americans adjusted faster. They learned every trade route, memorized every island passage, and waited where Japan least expected. And when Japan tried to protect its oil lifeline, tankers carrying crude from Borneo, Palembang, and Sumatra, the submarine struck hardest. Without oil, Japan's war machine was nothing. Its carriers couldn't sail, its tanks couldn't move, its factories couldn't run. The Americans didn't need to bomb Tokyo to cripple it, they just had to make sure the oil never arrived. By late 1944, Japan's situation was desperate. Fuel reserves dropped so low that training flights were cancelled. Warships were anchored permanently in port, serving as floating batteries because they had no fuel to move. Merchant captains refused to sail, the sea had become a graveyard. From the surface, it seemed the war still raged, but beneath, in the cold silence of the Pacific, the outcome had already been decided. The submarines had done what fleets and bombers could not. They had cut the veins of an empire, and watched it bleed in silence. Japan was learning too late that wars are not only lost on battlefields. Sometimes, they are lost between the waves. By late 1944, the once mighty Japanese empire was gasping for air. On the surface, the rising sun still flew proudly, but inside the heart of Tokyo's war machine, dread had taken root. The Admiralty's reports grew darker with each passing week: fleets without fuel, airfields without planes, armies without supplies. What no bomb or battle had achieved, the American submarines had done with silence. In the war rooms of the Imperial Navy, disbelief turned into fear. Admirals who once boasted of Japan's naval supremacy now stared at maps covered in red X's, each one marking another lost ship. Entire convoys had vanished. Tankers never returned. Merchant vessels were going down faster than Japan could build them. And worse, no one could explain how to stop it. Japan's anti-submarine efforts were nearly non-existent. Their destroyers lacked sonar, their depth charges were outdated, and their naval doctrine clung to an outdated sense of honor in open battle. Fighting an invisible enemy was alien to them, dishonorable even. Submarines, in their eyes, were weapons for cowards. But as one admiral bitterly admitted near the war's end, it is the coward's weapon that will destroy us. On distant islands like Rabaul, Truk, and the Philippines, the silence was even deadlier. Japanese soldiers waited for ships that would never come. Hunger became their constant enemy. Ammunition ran dry, uniforms rotted, and men died not from bullets, but from starvation. "The sea has abandoned us," one stranded officer wrote in his diary. "We can see Japan on the horizon, but we will never return." In the factories of Yokohama and Osaka, production slowed to a crawl. Oil reserves were so scarce that even transport trucks were ordered to stay idle. The great warships, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were moored permanently in their harbors. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, became a floating monument to Japan's arrogance, powerful but useless. There was no fuel to take her to sea. Still, Japanese propaganda tried to keep hope alive. Newspapers spoke of temporary setbacks, of American deception, of divine protection. But inside the military, everyone knew the truth. The empire was being strangled, not with bombs, but with mathematics. Every day, fewer ships left port. Every day, more men disappeared beneath the sea. Admiral Somu Toyoda, desperate to save what remained, ordered convoys to travel at night, hugging coastlines and hiding in fog. But the Americans were patient hunters. They had learned to predict not just where Japan's ships sailed, but when they had to. The Japanese needed food from Korea, coal from Manchuria, and oil from the Indies. Those were lifelines the Americans could trace like clockwork. When the USS Tang under Commander Richard O'Kane ambushed a Japanese convoy in October 1944, the results were catastrophic. In a single night, O'Kane sank 5 ships, sending thousands of tons of supplies to the bottom. The Japanese Navy called it the Night of Ghosts. Survivors described the explosions as the ocean itself turning against us. In Tokyo, senior officers began to whisper what none dared to say aloud: the empire was dying, not with a roar, but with a drowning gasp. Every failed convoy, every missing tanker, every unreturned ship was another heartbeat lost. For centuries, Japan had believed the ocean was its greatest ally, a divine moat protecting its islands from invasion. But now, that same ocean had become its executioner. The empire that rose from the sea was now being dragged back into it, by enemies it could neither see nor stop. By 1945, the Pacific had changed. What was once the proud domain of the Imperial Japanese Navy was now a graveyard of twisted steel and shattered pride. Beneath those waves, resting forever in cold darkness, lay the bones of an empire, merchant ships, tankers, transports, all consumed by the quiet fury of the American submarines. It didn't happen overnight. Victory crept in slowly, quietly, like the very submarines that made it possible. Each patrol, each torpedo, each silent ambush pushed Japan closer to collapse. When the year began, the empire still clung to its belief in destiny, that divine winds, or kamikaze, might save it once more. But destiny had no answer for the deep. The Americans ruled the unseen world beneath the surface, and Japan's gods could not protect what they could not find. By now, U.S. submarines had destroyed over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships and 8 million tons of vital cargo. Oil imports had fallen by more than 90%. Entire fleets were immobilized, their engines dry and useless. The Japanese Navy could no longer sail, the Air Force could barely fly, and factories that once fueled a war machine stood silent, starved of raw materials. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was economic suffocation. The empire had been built on movement, shipping, trade, expansion, and the submarines had stopped that movement entirely. Japan was trapped in its own waters, isolated by an invisible blockade more devastating than any bombing campaign. Even as American B-29s began firebombing Tokyo, the truth was clear: Japan had already been defeated, beneath the waves. Still, the submariners fought on, their missions as dangerous as ever. Each dive into enemy waters was a gamble between life and death. Many never returned. Of the 288 U.S. submarines that served in the war, 52 were lost, taking more than 3,500 men to watery graves. For every convoy they destroyed, they risked becoming ghosts themselves. Yet they kept going, because they knew their fight mattered more than anyone realized. In April 1945, when the colossal Yamato finally left port for her last mission, a desperate one-way charge toward Okinawa, she was already doomed. She had enough fuel for a single voyage. She would never return. Japan's greatest ship was sent out to die, not because of American bombers, but because submarines had stolen the empire's lifeblood long before. The Yamato's death was symbolic, the last heartbeat of a nation already drowned. As Emperor Hirohito prepared to announce surrender that August, he spoke not only of atomic bombs, but of the continuing loss of life and supply. The bombs may have ended the war dramatically, but the submarines had ended it quietly, patiently, relentlessly. They had waged the longest, coldest campaign of the Pacific, unseen, uncelebrated, but utterly decisive. When the war was over, the world celebrated the pilots, the generals, the great battles. Few remembered the men who fought in silence, who never saw the sky, who lived and died inside metal coffins. But historians would later call them what they truly were, the dagger that struck at the empire's heart. Because while the world looked up to the skies for victory, it was the deep that won the war. The U.S. submariners didn't conquer Japan with fire. They conquered it with silence, a silence so complete that even the mightiest empire on earth could not hear its own end approaching. And when that silence finally broke, the rising sun had set forever. When the guns finally fell silent and the Japanese emperor's voice echoed over the radio, the world thought it understood why the war had ended: the atomic bomb, the firestorms, the overwhelming force of America's armies. But beneath all that noise lay a different truth, a truth that history almost forgot. The war in the Pacific was not just won in the skies above Hiroshima or the beaches of Iwo Jima. It was won in the unseen depths of the Pacific Ocean, where American submariners fought an invisible, thankless war. They didn't march through cities or raise flags over ruins. They simply vanished into the sea, to hunt, to wait, to strike, and in doing so, they brought an empire to its knees. They were the ghosts of the deep, the men who made silence their weapon and patience their power. They watched Japan starve, watched its fleets wither, and knew that every sunken ship brought the war closer to its end. No songs were sung for them when they returned, and for 3,500 who never did, no graves could be marked. Yet their victory was as real as any ever won. For when the waves finally calmed, and the rising sun sank beneath the horizon, it wasn't the roar of bombers or the clash of armies that ended the empire. It was the whisper of the deep, and the silence that followed.